Don't ask how much I paid her for her to say all of that, okay? Welcome. So honored to have you all here. It's an honor and a privilege for us to have you in our town, and it doesn't happen often enough. I wish Mayor Koss was still here so he could hear me say this, but obviously I'm not a spring chicken. I've been around for a while. I've seen lots of mayors in different places all throughout the country. And I don't say this often, but I've never seen a mayor who is as supportive, as sensitive, and involved with the school and the field of deaf education as Mayor Koss is. Without fail, he attends our high school graduation on a yearly basis. And often when we have banquets that are hosted by civic organizations, and NMSD is part of those to recognize students and their achievement, as well as hand them awards, different grades, middle school and high school. Not only does Mayor Koss attend, but without fail, he always recognizes NMSD, recognizes it as a special place that's held in his heart. And as a school for the deaf, the state school, we are not under the city of Santa Fe per se, but he is always so supportive of us and there for us regarding city issues. And one fact to share with you, although NMSD, we talked about how long we've been in existence, and Santa Fe is over 400 years old, but NMSD is older than the state of New Mexico, because New Mexico was established in 1912, and we were established in 1885. So, with that, we don't have much time to present to you this morning, so I'd like to continue to talk with you about an important campaign on behalf of deaf and hard of hearing children. It's the most important campaign we've had in our history. So I'd like to dedicate this platform this morning to the Child First campaign. Many of you are teaching educators, and you're known as shapers. And that's of children who are deaf or hard of hearing for their future as adults. And that can determine their life outcomes, the quality of education that they provide. So if teachers are shapers, then you are shapers of those shapers. And I look forward to the time with you this morning and for the rest of the weekend. Child First and quality education are both synonymous. And it provides a cause and effect relationship. I strongly believe, as you will hear more about, that child achievement is hugely dependent on the quality of their education. Can someone click the PowerPoint for me? Go back one. Yep. So I'm welcoming you to NMSD in Santa Fe. As many of you know, I'm a diehard Yankees fan from New York City. But I love Yogi Berra. I'm sure you've heard of him. He's a Hall of Fame catcher. 87. He's 87. And today he's very well known for his humorous yet powerful quotes. And it's funny that he doesn't even try to be funny, Yogi Berra, but what comes out of him ends up being so. And also very insightful. So one quote I wanted to share with you this morning. He said, "It gets late early out there." And there's two powerful meanings here for us. First of all, in speaking of Santa Fe, things close early here. The stores, the restaurants, many things close early. So if you want to go shopping or go experience the town, go early. But also in the field of education, it gets very late. If we stand back, if we do not move forward with the Child First, then things can look bleak. So now is the time. We need everyone's serious participation and commitment. This is more wisdom from Yogi Berra, 2 more statements that he made. His English is not necessarily the Queen's English, but it still makes a lot of sense. And of course, it goes without saying that it's easy to predict the future. Things change in the world, things become more complex. There are pros and cons. Parents of deaf children today have more options than they have in the past. And that is definitely a positive thing, but with that comes more confusion, and that can be detrimental to deaf children. And when I say deaf, I mean to include both deaf and hard of hearing children. But we can determine the future. If we just sit back and allow things to work themselves out, then the future will be terrible for deaf children. We have to be so cautious in how we proceed to make sure that we have a secure and healthy education for deaf and hard of hearing children. Briefly, I'd like to touch on the goals of my presentation this morning. First of all, the important role that each and every one of you play as leaders, as professionals, and as human beings. We'll also talk about challenges now and in the future, where we are today, what has changed as of late, especially in regards to the IDEA, which was known as Public Law 94142, passed in the 1970s, and talk about the intent of that law. The name is different today, but the spirit of the law still holds true. But we'll talk about what the changes have been since it was enacted. Your products, meaning those you teach and work with, we know there's a variety of people here. We have researchers, we have teacher trainers, we have a whole variety of people in this room today. We'll also talk about quality education and Child First, which we started about 3 or 4 years ago. There's been some misunderstandings, and so it's a great opportunity for me to clarify what that's all about, and also to touch on what Child First is not as well. You have a copy of the brochure, and don't read it now, but that talks about the core, indisputable, fundamental principles of the Child First campaign. And that's for full child development, quality education, and they're principles that really should be for everyone, if not just for deaf or hard of hearing children, but for any child. And it doesn't matter if they are deaf or hard of hearing or if they sign, but these should be principles that drive the quality education for them. And too often it's elusive. Research clearly shows that the most important person at the school who has the greatest impact on a student's learning and achievement is the classroom teacher. You are really shaping those teachers. And the best way for schools to improve in education is to have outstanding teachers who are committed to children and committed to continuing to be quality teachers. And those are the concerns I'm sharing with you this morning. As I was preparing for my presentation this morning, I thought I might focus on your specific role as teacher educators. And I didn't do a scientific survey of the group, but I spoke with principals at NMSD. I also contacted some colleagues just to take a pulse all over the country on how they felt teachers were doing well, how they felt they could improve, And again, this is not scientifically based. But we hire teachers from teacher education programs, of course. And with that, we hire young, inexperienced educators. And in a rapidly changing world, there are some common patterns of strengths and weaknesses emerging. So I'll quickly touch on those. I have to thank you all and say that you must continue as teacher education programs for deaf and hard of hearing children. In general education programs, your role is so important, specifically for those deaf and hard of hearing children. Quality has two different meanings. It means, in general, a productive teacher who does a nice job, gets their state requirements met for licensure, and also has a content background and degree in the subject they're teaching. The second level, for example. A math teacher would have a BA in math, for example. 5 or 6 years ago, the challenge was often that the teachers could not meet state licensure requirements. But we've noticed that there has been an improvement in that over the years, and the rigor of academic standards has been increased for teachers who can pass those requirement tests. And by highly qualified, it also means that we produce teachers who understand the unique needs of deaf children, language needs, etc. We need trained teachers of the deaf, because only they can provide our deaf and hard of hearing children with opportunities for them to become active learners. Too often, you'll see deaf children as passive learners in the classroom. Perhaps they use an interpreter and they feel disengaged from the environment. They cannot participate fully in what's happening in that classroom. And with a trained teacher of the deaf, that does not happen. Engagement occurs. The student can become an active learner. Direct communication, as you all know, nothing beats direct communication. Interpreters are important, yes, but interpreted communication never equals direct communication. Teachers of the deaf allow deaf children to be social and communal. When I wrote my dissertation a few years ago, my conceptual framework was based on Bronfenbrenner. He talked about the biological theory of human development. And Bronfenbrenner really had nothing to do with the field of deaf education or the deaf. But he really hit the nail on the head here with what he found and what was really elusive, these critical issues in our field. He stated that the brain and the environment operate reciprocally. So oftentimes the debate was it nature, was it nurture, was it the environment that affects the child? But now that's not really the issue that's debated anymore. The environment and the brain are working and equally parallel for that experience. That student's interaction with people in their environment, that quality of interaction, and the variety of individuals they are interacting with, whether that's peers, those who are younger than themselves or older, it's a fundamental part of their development. So the point is, as educators, we must be more mindful than ever before as we work with children and work with their parents, as well as other individuals, emphasizing that we need to allow children to be social and communal. Research clearly indicates that children learn more from social experience and interaction than from books. Incidental learning is crucial. Learning through interaction in the classroom or outside of the classroom, at school or at home. As human beings, we are the most social and communal beings of any other species. So thank you for being in this business, and this is where we stand here. As far as strengths and needs that were recognized by those I discussed. And of course, it's not a finished product. We're never finished products. We're always learning. And that will continue on through the rest of our lives. But just to throw out some food for thought, as you return home and think about what you can do to improve your programs and to do more. When teachers first arrive, it's often difficult for them to meet the needs of the diverse population in their classroom. They need to make sure that their approach and their materials are not a one-size-fits-all, but rather are differentiated for each of those students. It's a fact in today's world that kids are becoming even more heterogeneous and diverse. Their learning profile, their needs, strengths, that's the teacher's job, to meet each one of those for the students, to meet them on their level. And that is a huge challenge for new teachers. Really, for any teacher, that is true. But I encourage you to ask yourselves if you're doing enough in regard to those programs and the students in meeting their needs. It's an amazing number of individuals today who are doing a lot of work, a lot of paperwork. The paperwork that goes into the job of being a teacher, whether that's lesson plans or coming up with IEPs, parent documents, going above and beyond to get that paperwork done. So teachers are having to deal with an increasing amount of paperwork. Another challenge is Common Core standards. I think 40 states now have adopted Common Core standards, and that's another new challenge that teachers are exposed to. What the Common Core standards are all about. As far as assessment goes, when you're looking at curriculum and instruction, they have to be intertwined. Using assessment information to apply that to the instruction of teachers is a challenge, and that gets better with time. The summative assessment, some district tests, end of chapter tests, or midterm final exams, are summative. But then there are formative assessments. And that's where we have a weakness amongst newer teachers. Teachers have to continue to assess their own teaching abilities. And looking at the student's mastery of what the teacher is instructing them, whether that's informal or formal. And getting the students themselves involved in their own assessment. Allowing students to truly understand what they are learning and what they're not learning. And obviously we don't have time to go into great detail about this, but I did want to touch on that quickly. More than ever before, we and all teachers and educators must be advocates for children, for their parents, in providing parents with comprehensive information. Also, issues that impact the field of deaf ed, such as the Child First campaign. We must work together on behalf of children. We are asking more and more of teachers today, and administrators as well. So we must rise to the challenge because it is there. Are you following me okay so far? Not long ago, just a couple of weeks, I read something that I thought really made sense. There's the law of unintentional consequences. A powerful law in our lives today. Oftentimes there are good intentions behind a law that is enacted, whether that's a law or a policy. But over time, in practice, the well-intentioned law is not necessarily carried out. And that law applies to all areas, not just children, but to adults too. And mentioning the ADA as another example, the Americans with Disabilities Act, when that was passed, the intention was to increase job opportunities for, quote, disabled people. And as a result, there are actually less jobs for people with disabilities because businesses and employers are afraid to hire someone in case they need to, for some reason, terminate them or some other action needs to be taken. And so that is an unintended consequence of the law. Public Law 94142 is another example. The most important word in the IEP is I, individual. Looking at the individual child, their goals and their strengths, and making placement decisions based on those strengths and needs. Not using a one-size-fits-all approach. But over time, sadly, the I for individual has been less important and less of a priority, and that needs to stop. We're not doing justice to our diverse student population. So this makes sense for many special ed populations, the law of unintended consequences. Focusing on full inclusion, mainstreaming the special ed child with non-disabled peers to the greatest extent possible. Perhaps that works for many special ed children. And as you know, special ed children in the past had just really low quality educations. They were placed in the back of the classroom, they were in trailers, and expectations were low for them, much lower than regular education kids. So now, they believe that if they put a child who has language and communication needs into a regular education class, that solves the entire problem. But that is not the case. So we understand the idea behind full inclusion, but first things first. I love the work of Thomas Heyer. He's the head of the Office of Special Education Programs under the U.S. Department of Education, which is also called OSERS. And the Villa, who is the head of OSERS, they also have an Office of Special Education Programs, which is called OSEP. So he's a professor at Harvard, Heyer, and he wrote a wonderful book called Eliminating Ableism from Policy and Practice. There's racism, sexism, all the various isms, and he coined the term ableism in regards to children with disabilities or in special education. Is it the child themselves who is disabled, or is it the environment around them that is disabling? In Public Law 94142 and in other regulations, are we following the law or the actual spirit of the law as teachers and administrators? And oftentimes you'll hear, well, this is what the administration wants us to do. But we need to be more genuine to our children than that, and passionate about what is right and best for the deaf child. So our robust agenda is to go back to the intent of the law. Although Child First started in 2009 or 2010, we've already seen a great shift from when it was first enacted. CEASD, which is the Organization for Educational Administrators for the Deaf, started this whole program, and we realized that the window of opportunity for the definition of LRE when they were reenacting the IDEA was coming up. We need to consider the language and communication needs of the child, and that will provide with communication. So we talked about those issues, and with that in mind, we hired a consultant who's not from the field of deaf education, but is very experienced in special education and has close ties with the U.S. Congress and Department of Education. And so as we went through this process in Washington, D.C., who's going through a lot of change right now, we hired this consultant, and we've been working with her for over a year now. And it was really a reality check for us. We saw that the language of the law, changing the language of the law, was very difficult. So we're focusing more on the interpretation and implementation of that law, and also the monitoring of that law and following it. So problems have arisen. There's administration issues, the U.S. Congress, as far as the IDEA reauthorization, have held that on the back burner as of late because of other issues they're dealing with, of course, as you know, the economy. So now we're wondering if IDEA reauthorization will ever happen. It might not. So the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, as well as No Child Left Behind and IDEA, all of those laws, they're trying to streamline. Therefore, we shifted gears. Instead of focusing on the reauthorization of the IDEA, in CEASD, as well working with NAD, we decided to look at what we could do on the federal level in Washington, D.C. We developed the Alice Cogswell Act, which is a standalone bill. And realistically, the chances of that bill becoming law are slim. It would be fantastic if it did become law. And we know it would look different than now what we have stated. There would be changes made to it. But at least it would be a powerful messaging bill. So we encourage all superintendents of schools, and all of you included, to speak with the U.S. congressmen in your states. Congressmen who serve on educational committee, the Educational Committee in Washington, D.C., and others who have an impact on education of the deaf. Working with the United States Department of Education, starting partnerships, and just bringing more awareness about the issues facing our deaf children in our field. If that bill does not become law, then those relationships and that process will still serve us very well. You have the Child First brochure in your hands. If you would please, after you leave, read that brochure. For deaf and hard of hearing children in your area, and as you work with future teachers, we ask you to be an advocate for this movement as well. There is a list of core fundamental principles in that brochure. There is a parallel bill for the blind children, the blind community, and it's Helen Keller's first teacher. It was named after her. It's the Anne Sullivan Macy bill. Anne Sullivan was a famous teacher, and Macy is her married name. So of course we named our bill after one of the first students, deaf students, Alice Cogswell, and they're parallel bills in many ways. If you would like access to the Alice Cogswell bill, you can check our CEASD website. It needs to be updated, the website. In a couple of months we will have a brand new one. But as of now, you can click on the Child First link to the left of the web page, and you will see the bill there. If you have thoughts or feedback, please let us know. Now we'll just touch on every fundamental principle that is laid out in the brochure you have in front of you. So talking about communication and language as a human and educational right. And as you notice, we're not just talking about ASL or spoken language. This is a principle that applies to all modes of communication. And it is language deprivation that is disabling. I'm not sure if you were aware, but when Helen Keller got to the end of her life, someone asked her if she could start all over again and had a choice, would she rather be deaf or blind? Guess what she said? After careful deliberation on that question, she said she'd rather be blind. And when asked why, what she said was very powerful. She said that blind people are disconnected from things, while deaf people are disconnected from other people. There's nothing more disabling or dehumanizing than to be disconnected from people. And of course, that's due to not having language or communications. Keep in mind that Helen Keller lived in a different world in her time. She never knew what it was like to be only deaf or only blind. But still, today, her statement holds a lot of truth. More work from an individual named Kozel. He wrote Savage Inequalities. And again, he was not connected to the field of deaf education. He more looked at impoverished children in St. Louis, in Chicago, Washington, D.C., L.A. He looked at children of color and the impact of them being impoverished. I inserted a quote here, and it says that delayed access to language and communication is neurotoxic. The heart of VL2, Dr. Laurel and Petito's work shows more and more that through neuroimaging work, it's clear. The brain wants to be stimulated. It doesn't care how it's stimulated, whether that's through visual stimuli or auditory stimuli. The brain wants to be stimulated, and that allows it to develop cognitive skills, and it has a profound impact for academics and becoming a whole person, as well as impacting a whole life outcomes. So in Kozel's work, he was speaking of hearing children, but it holds even more meaning for deaf children. Access to all interactions, like I mentioned with Bronfenbrenner's work. Deaf children must be able to interact in and out of the classroom, at school and at home. Another quote from Kozel. In italics, it says deaf and hard of hearing children because he didn't say that in the original quote. But it says some powerful things. And it says, all too often, the deaf or hard of hearing child's human potential is chipped away by the environment. And it's not because of the child. Much more often than not. It's that we're underachievers. The key is the environment. Our expectations for the student and what happens at home and at school. Whether they're allowed to be social and communal. It's a very powerful statement from Kozel. And Freire said something in a bit of a different way. He said that the impoverished child, the oppressed child, typically is instructed in a way that reflects their experience and where they come from. I know it goes without saying that many deaf or hard of hearing children outside of school don't have access to people, the communications around them. People often say they can't because they're deaf. But what they experience at school is not much different than what they experience outside. And that impacts their self-worth, being passive. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That idea of, I can't, I'm limited, I need to just accept this. Instead of being a self-advocate, we have to think about this. And Child First addresses that. Parents have a record amount of information in today's world. But we need to make sure that parents are receiving accurate and balanced information so that parents can become more qualified decision makers at the IEP table or at home for their deaf and hard of hearing children. This has been a weak area in the past, and parents are not getting balanced information. Just a few more Child First principles. Like I mentioned, it should not be placement first. We should be looking at the child first, their needs and their strengths, which then drives the best possible placement decision for them. Always thinking of the local program first as meeting their LRE needs is not the way to go. And even more so than before, that has been the mindset. Placement decisions become almost predetermined before even the discussion occurs at an IEP meeting. There are many, many pathways to language learning. There are visual learners, auditory learners, learning from others, individuals around you. There are many pathways for your brain to be stimulated, to learn and develop. One way is not going to do it. There must be a variety to meet the diverse needs of the children. Family involvement, that's self-explanatory. Qualified professionals and teachers, educational diagnosticians and counselors are vital. That's another weak area of the field that we must do more in. Another passion of Child First, and the Alice Cogswell bill addresses this, all of these principles, including the fact that we need to recognize that the deaf and hard of hearing children are undercounted. How deaf children are doing on their tests gets lost because oftentimes they're put into a special ed classroom and the numbers are not clear. That's enough. We know that they are as different from the other special ed children as they are their hearing peers. So the point is that the field needs to do a better job of getting clear data together in assessing how our children are learning and doing in school, whether that's academically, socially, or in any other area. One size fits all is not acceptable. We've talked about this already. The thought about access being portable. Is it the local school or that you can bring access to? Well, the curriculum is portable, but access is not. So we need to be careful how that access is provided to the deaf or hard of hearing child. I also want to use this opportunity to make one thing clear. Many people think that Child First campaign is about saving residential schools for the deaf. That's not the case. We are about all of these principles and about ensuring that each option on the continuum of placement must have residential schools as one of those options, as part of that. Must be an equal option as well as the local school. And all of these options must be of quality in order to meet the deaf child's needs. And that's what this is about. Child First really represents a do or die campaign. If we continue to sit back, then the future is bleak for deaf children and their education. We might think that some issues will take care of themselves and they'll be resolved, but critical issues do not go away by themselves. Issues that need to be addressed in our field will not go away by themselves. If you sit back and think, excuse my French, if you do a half-assed effort in your commitment, it's not going to work. This is a time of essence. So I'm asking all of you to please be a part of this Child First campaign to raise the quality of education for today's and tomorrow's deaf children. It's a collaboration. We must work together. So please jump on the Child First bandwagon. We have CEASD, NAD, and co-builders. So we're starting in our own backyard, we're starting to build, and we're expanding. Reaching out to different organizations, others in the community. And the more we collaborate, the more powerful our campaign will be. We're of low incidence. So that means misunderstandings have a great impact. And there's a higher incidence of misunderstandings. So the more we bring awareness and understanding to these issues, the more that actual change can happen for today's and tomorrow's deaf children and their education. We must stay focused. We don't want to lose sight of these important principles that I've mentioned this morning. We can't afford to lose that focus and look at the big picture at the end of the day. Staying in focus, staying in touch with Child First and what's happening is very important. You can check the CEASD website. And the information will be updated from time to time. It's being distributed on more and more websites. You can get in touch with us. And as a community, as a group, we can make a difference. Each and every one of us can make a difference. It's the power of one. Relationship with parents, with legislators. We never know what can come of those or what they will lead to. A ripple effect can take place with just a tiny stone. All too often within our field, we focus on our disagreements. But there are things we can agree on. The Child First principles are indisputable and fundamental. So we must stick to those principles and not lose focus. The A.G. Bell Association, there's huge collaboration within their community, and we need to follow the principles of Child First in working together with all different organizations. Quality education is not expensive. It's really priceless. Quality education equals quality of life. What a child experiences and learns as they grow into an adult can affect what kind of life they will have when they grow up. It's priceless for all of us. But sadly, it's all too often elusive for deaf and hard of hearing children. So if a quality education is priceless, then so are each and every one of you, each one of us, as part of Child First. So I look forward to talking with you more in the days of the conference. Thank you so much.